Hi everyone, my name is Becky Rosiska, and I'm going to be going through the Graminoid species with you. So those are the grasses, rushes, and sedges that you need to know for your range plant ID. And so we're going to go plant by plant, and I'm going to point out some of the most helpful characteristics for identifying these plants, and also just some of the general characteristics and ecology of each species. The first grass on your list is Agropyron cristatum, common name crested wheatgrass. It is an introduced species, and it is invasive, although it's not as invasive as some of the other species on your list. It's also a cool season forage grass, and that's one of the reasons it was introduced to the West. The other reason is because it's been very popular with Department of Transportation seeding programs, because it does do a good job of reducing erosion along roadsides and in other areas, and it does establish quickly, and so that's been a very popular use of this grass across the western United States, and it's allowed it to be introduced across a wide area. It is a perennial bunch grass, and you can see that it does grow very strongly in that bunch grass shape. And also because it is a wheatgrass, it has auricles. So all of the wheatgrasses that we're going to encounter have auricles, and if you see auricles, you can be sure that it's a wheatgrass. So that's kind of one of the characteristics I want you to key in on as a way to pare this list down and kind of group these plants by their characteristics. So what are auricles? If you look over here on the right-hand side, you can see the arrow is pointing to those kind of brown pincher-like appendages that wrap the stem. That's what we're talking about when we say auricles. The other characteristic of this plant that you can use to identify it is the flattened spike type inflorescence. If you look down at the bottom lower right hand side, you can see the little spikelets coming off of this inflorescence are at 180 degrees to each other. So it makes this kind of flattened plain spike inflorescence. And that's a great characteristic because you'll not only see it with the New Year's growth, but you'll often commonly see it as remnant of last year's growth. The second species on your list is Bromus tectorum, or cheatgrass. It is a strongly invasive grass, and in fact it's been a successful invader all across the western United States, and unfortunately has had kind of disastrous ecological impacts in that it alters fire regimes and also changes native plant species compositions. It's an annual grass, so it has a very shallow root system. If you look down at that middle photograph, you can see the roots there depicted, and that is the entire root system for one plant. It's also one of the characteristics is that it's very hairy, but maybe the best characteristic to identify it is the panicle inflorescence. So it's got a panicle type inflorescence that's densely branched with nodding seed heads. So if you take a look at those seed heads, you can see how kind of the weight of the seed head and the very long awns kind of pull the panicle down, and so those awns are kind of facing the ground, kind of pulling down to the ground. That's what we mean by a nodding seed head. That's a very good characteristic to key in on for this plant. Also, early growth forms can be purplish in color. That's because it grows very early in the season. And so those early growth forms will be purplish, and it turns brown in mid to late summer. The next grass on your list is Bromus inermis, common name smooth brome. It's another introduced species, and it's also strongly rhizomatous, so once it is introduced to an area, it will tend to spread fairly readily. It's a perennial cool season grass, so one of the first grasses out there that's going to green up and start growing early in the season. And it also has a panicle type inflorescence. So if you take a look at the bottom middle photograph, you can see that it's maybe kind of reminiscent of Bromus tectorum, but one of the identifying features is that it has no awns. So if you think of smooth brome, no awns. It also has no auricles because it's not a wheatgrass, and it has very smooth and wide leaves. And also, oddly enough, and this is the best characteristic to identify it by, is on every leaf you'll find either an M or a W, depending on which way you hold it. And this M or W is almost like braille. You can kind of like, if you run your fingers down the leaf, you can kind of feel it with your fingers, and you can also see it. So if you take a look at the photographs on the bottom left-hand side, you can see where the arrow is kind of pointing, that faint M or W on the leaf. And so that is the dead ringer characteristic for this plant. The next species on your list is Carricks. It's actually not a species, it's an entire genus. We don't make you identify the species just because there are just so many in the Mountain West area. They can typically be found in riparian areas, but there are several varieties that are found in xeric or upland areas. One of the characteristics to look at is the terminal inflorescence. This just means that the inflorescence appears at the top of the plant. Okay, so we're going to contrast that later to the Junkas genus. The leaves also originate from the base of the plant, and probably the best characteristic to identify them is the fact that they come off in threes. So if you look at that picture down there where it shows the 3 ranked leaves, you can see how they kind of form a triangle pattern. Most grasses that you're going to see come off in 2s. Okay, so if you see leaves in 3s, it's a Carricks. They also have triangular stems. So you can kind of associate that with this genus, the triangular stems, the triangular pattern of the leaves, and that'll help you identify Carricks species. They also tend to be yellow to light greenish in color most of the time. The next grass on your list is one of my favorites. It's scientific name Butylloa gracilis, common name blue grama. It's Colorado's state grass. It is a perennial grass, it's a native grass, and it's a warm season decreaser. The best way to identify this grass is through the inflorescence, and luckily there's often inflorescences left over from last season, so you don't have to rely on this year's growth. And so you can see, especially after it's dried, it really resembles an eyelash. It's a panicle type inflorescence, although it looks like a spike. And it has unilateral spicate branches. So just what that means is that all of the branches come off on one side, and you can see that as it dries especially, it curls over and it tends to resemble an eyelash. So it does have short rhizomes, so it's kind of weakly rhizomatous. It's not a bunch grass. And it tends to form these dense mats with the kind of hairy curled leaves. And if you look very closely, you can see that the ligule is a fringe of hairs. The next grass is Danthonia perrii, common name Perry's oat grass. This is another perennial native bunch grass. And it has awns with a slightly flattened base. And one of the better characteristics to identify it by are the large papery glooms. If you take a look at the photograph on the bottom right-hand side, you can see how those glooms are very large relative to the rest of the parts of the inflorescence. So that's a great characteristic. Also, it has yellowish green leaves that originate from the base of the plant. And another dead giveaway characteristic are the tufts of hairs at the collar. So while blue grama tends to have very fine, like kind of straggly hairs, this grass is going to have a very dense tuft of hair right in the collar region. And also very commonly these grasses grow, they grow from the bottom out, and so there's often dead tips. And so you'll see kind of the leaves are kind of half brown, half green. And that's another good characteristic to recognize this grass. Elymus elamoides, commonly known as, or common name Bottlebrush Squirreltail, is another one of the perennial native bunch grasses on your list. It is a wheatgrass, so it has auricles and also a spike type inflorescence. Remember, the auricles are those kind of clasping appendages that come from the collar region. It has 2 spikelets per node on the inflorescence, and probably the best characteristic to recognize it by are that the fact that the spikelets are long-awned. So about 5 to 15 millimeters, and both the lemmas and the glooms are awned. And those awns are divergent or bent out at maturity. So if you take a look at that photo in the middle of the screen, you can see where those awns are kind of bending out after that seed head matures. And, kind of maybe reminiscent of a bottle brush, which is where it gets the first part of its common name. For the other part, if you take a look at that photograph on the left-hand side, you can see those kind of purplish awns very long awns, maybe a little bit reminiscent of a squirrel tail. So that's one of the characteristics that you can remember this grass by, Bulimus elamoides. Elaemus lanceolatus is another wheatgrass on your list. Common name is Griffiths Weekus. It's a perennial native cool season grass, and because it is a wheatgrass, it has auricles, and it also has a spike type inflorescence. It's also a rhizomatous grass, so you're not going to see it growing in a bunch form. Usually the inflorescence has one spikelet per node, and importantly to note, the lemmas are awned on the inflorescence. So they're about 1 to 2 millimeters long and divergent or bent out at maturity. Festuca idahoensis is a perennial native bunch grass, probably one of the most easily recognizable bunch grasses that you have. It's a cool season decreaser. It's fairly sensitive to grazing pressure. And it has this very fine growth form. So if you take a look at the leaves, this is the best characteristic, and it's the only plant on your list that's going to be like this. Take a look at those leaves. They're all coming out from the base of the plant, so they're basal, and they're rolled. So they're very fine foliage, and they're round. If you were to pick one of those leaves, you can actually roll it between your fingers. That's how round they are. And they do kind of have a very characteristic yellowish green color. And once they do form seed heads, they're short awns. Hesperus Kamata is another one of your perennial native bunch grasses. Common name for this plant is needle and thread. And you can see how it might have gotten that name. Probably comes from the very long awns, about 10 to 15 millimeters long. You can see they're pretty conspicuous when you look at the inflorescence. Another conspicuous characteristic of this plant is the old flag leaf, or what's termed old flag leaf. So take a look over on the right hand side. You can see where the arrow is pointing to that kind of dead vegetation. That's actually the leaf. That's part of the leaf dies back, and once it does that, it kind of forms a curlicue pattern. And so to me, it's kind of reminiscent of maybe like a twirling flag or something like that. That's a good characteristic to recognize it by. Probably the dead giveaway characteristic is the ligule, and it's a large plant overall, and it also has a large ligule. And that ligule is long and split, so it's going to come into two pieces at the ends. You can see over on the bottom right hand side where the arrow is pointing, that's like one half of the ligule is split, and so this ligule characteristic is a dead giveaway for this plant. The next plant is Junkas Arcticus, which is not a grass, it's a rush. And so we said earlier that we wanted to contrast this with the Carricks species. You can see that it's fairly distinct. So Junkas is round, has a round unjointed stem. And so you might get it confused maybe with Festuca idahoensis, which also has round leaves. But Junkas, you're going to notice, is just growing as a single leaf or a single stem coming up from the base. It doesn't grow in bunches. It is rhizomatous, and so it's going to spread out over an area. It grows in any areas where there's a high water table, so you're going to find it very closely linked to the riparian area. And it has an inflorescence that comes out midway up the stem. So in contrast to the Carricks plants, where the inflorescence comes out at the top of the stem, this inflorescence for Junkas Arcticus comes out midway up the stem. So if you take a look at that photo on the lower right hand side, you can see that inflorescence. It also does have a high silica content, and that makes it able to stand up tall and erect despite the narrowness of that stem. Calaria macrantha, also known as Jun Grass, is a small perennial native bunch grass. It's kind of a petite little grass. It has fine hairs on the leaves, and if you were able to feel it, you would notice that it feels soft. And some of these basal leaves are twisted, so some of the older growth is going to be twisted. So just the leaves at the base of the plant. The other characteristic about this plant, probably the most recognizable, is this kind of panicle inflorescence. that tends to open and close, although you won't know that from a photograph. But just pay attention to that kind of open panicle, kind of small seed heads, and that's a great way to recognize this plant. Also note that to be able to tell it apart from some of the other bunch grass wheatgrasses, you'll notice that this is not a wheatgrass, so it does not have an auricle, and that's a good characteristic to key in on to try to separate these plants. The next grass is Leucopoa kingii. It's a very beautiful grass, typically found under ponderosa pines in the Pingree area. We're not sure exactly why. I haven't heard an explanation for why it grows under ponderosa, but it does tend to grow in conjunction with ponderosa pine. It's a perennial native plant and tends to be very large. It's kind of a large, stately grass. It's called Leucopoa kingii, and the common name is king fescue. And that's because the ligule is very prominent, so it's about 3 to 4 millimeters long. And rather than being pointed, it's kind of got this serrated edge to it. So the botanical term is eros, but you can see it kind of resembles a king's crown. And so that's where that common name comes from, in the kingii. At least that's my understanding of it. So that's a great feature to identify this plant. It also tends to be bluish green in color, and it's fairly weakly rhizomatous plant. This next grass is another favorite of mine. It's called Muhlenbergii Montana, or mountain muley, it's the common name. It's a perennial native bunch grass and frequently has dead centers. So if you take a look over on the right-hand side, you can see how it's got this nice bunch grass form. And then what it tends to do is to grow outward from the center. So the new growth is on the outward side of the plant, and then the old growth is in the center, and frequently that will die back. And so what it tends to create is this kind of like Friar Tuck-esque growth form to it. And I think that that's a great characteristic to recognize it by. Another dead giveaway for this grass is also the fact that it has a very prominent long ligule. And so if you take a look at the bottom right-hand side, you can see that large ligule relative to the size of the grass. So it's a small grass with a large ligule. And you don't have to use your imagination very much to see that that kind of resembles a mule's ear. So you can associate that with a name. So it's the small grass with the large ligule that resembles a mule's ear, and its name is Muhlenbergii Montana. Also, additionally, it has a light green color, very fine leaves, as I mentioned, very short-statured grass, and it has awns that are short and irregularly bent at maturity. Your next grass is Limus smithii, common name Western wheatgrass. It's a perennial native cool season grass, and it's very strongly rhizomatous. In fact, it's so strongly rhizomatous that it's actually a sod-forming grass. And because it's a wheatgrass, it has auricles, of course, and it also has a spike-type inflorescence with one spikelet per node. It's a good way to distinguish it from the other wheatgrasses. And also those awns, or the florets, are awn-tipped. So if you take a look over at the right-hand side, that photograph, you can see those tiny little awns on the tips of the florets. It's also blue-green in color, and I think that this is a good way to recognize it. It might take a little bit more practice, so as you become more familiar with these grasses, you might be able to pick that out. Another good characteristic that I use is that the leaves are actually rough to the touch, which may not do you a lot of good virtually, but they're so rough that you can actually see the ridges in the photograph. So if you take a look at that photograph where it's pointing out the clasping auricles, you can actually see those prominent ridges in the leaves, and that's what gives it that rough texture. And so that's another good characteristic to use to identify this grass. Your next plant is Phleum pratense. Common name is Timothy. If you have horses or other livestock, you might already be familiar with it. Timothy mountain hay is commonly regarded as some of the best in terms of forage and production. It is a perennial introduced plant, very common across the western United States, typically found in more moist soils, so you'll find a lot in riparian areas and in meadows. It has a very dense spike-like panicle inflorescence. The fact that it's a panicle maybe isn't as important to you because you have to actually dissect that to determine that it's a panicle. But I would recommend keying in on just the general shape of the inflorescence. To me, it kind of resembles a rabbit's foot. It's kind of soft and fuzzy. And so I think that that's a great characteristic to look at to identify this plant. Also, you'll notice that it has a very prominent bulb at the base of the plant. This is very common during the early season growing phase. Your next plant could be one of the most common plants in North America. I'm not positive about that, but it is fairly ubiquitous. It's what forms your typical urban lawn. This is the most common lawn plant. It is scientific name Poa pratensis, common name Kentucky bluegrass. It's introduced from Europe, not Kentucky. And it's really found anywhere where there's extra moisture. It's a very thirsty plant. So you'll find it in quote-unquote run-in areas, which is kind of like a depression in the soil, or roadside, anywhere where there's going to be a little bit extra moisture collecting. That's where you're going to find it. It is very strongly rhizomatous, forms a thick sod, and that's what people like about it for their lawns. To identify it, at least to the genus Poa, the boat-shaped leaf tips are probably the best characteristic. So what I mean by that, if you take a look down in the left-hand side, you can see how the two sides of the leaf come together and are kind of fused together, and they form what looks like the keel of a canoe. That's what we're talking about with those boat-shaped tips. So once you see that, you know that you have the genus Poa. And to identify pratensis, you can take a look at the florets. So all the florets have right at the base of them, they have kind of a cobwebby material, and that's a great way to separate Poa pratensis from the other Poa species. The final genus on your list is Poa Spa. So this is going to be all of the bluegrasses except for Poa pratensis. These plants are perennial and native, and they are bunch grasses. They also have those characteristic boat-shaped leaf tips, as all plants in the genus Poa do. So the best way to determine if it's a Poa Spa or Poa pratensis is the fact that Poa Spa plants are going to be bunch grasses, whereas Poa pratensis is going to be rhizomatous. Additionally, Poa Spa is going to have a pointed ligule several millimeters long, whereas Poa pratensis has a very minimal ligule. Okay, so that's it for the grasses. I hope this PowerPoint was informative and useful to you. And don't forget to study your plants. Alrighty, good luck.